Hey everyone, welcome to the Wargaming Parrot. I'm David, and today we're going to be talking about how to pet and hug your parrot. Now this was requested on a poll I did over on my community tab. If you don't look at my community, it's worth having a peek. I put sort of quizzes, polls, and occasionally cute pictures of the birds on there. And Scampy's joining me, just having a couple of snacks with me. So this is, I thought, was a very important video to do because a lot of people ask how to pet and hug their birds, how do I interact with them in that way, and I thought it was important to show people how to encourage that behaviour, why it's useful to encourage that behaviour, and also reasons to do it properly and not inappropriately, because there is a very certain way you should pet and hug your bird, and there's certain ways you really shouldn't. So I'm going to cover all those factors. First I'm going to talk about how you can encourage it, then I'm going to talk about why you should encourage it and why you shouldn't encourage it, and the problems that can arise if you do it inappropriately. So firstly, I'll start with ways you can encourage petting and hugging behaviour. It's mostly petting for most birds. Occasionally conures may want to be cuddled, but we'll go into that a bit later. So first of all, my first tip is don't force it. Don't try and force them to pet and hug you. Don't try and push yourself on them, because it can break the trust and it can cause the complete opposite result. So if you're constantly putting your fingers and your hands in your bird's face, it may start associating them with a fear response, especially if you've only just got them. So take it easy and don't force the interaction. Leading on from this, lots of positive reinforcement and bonding exercises. So get your bird used to your hands by being around you and seeing you as a positive influence. So constantly treat them, just do the sort of things I recommend in my other videos. So sit around a cage, just have your hands moving but not in a threatening way, nice and slow and deliberate, and constantly treat, constantly reinforce. A great way of starting to get petting behaviour encouraged is desensitization. Before you can even start trying to touch your bird, you want your bird used to your hand. You want them to be okay with it, you want them to be okay with you moving it around. So you can start by literally just very slowly moving your hand around in front of your bird while they're in the cage, just moving it around and then reinforcing calm behaviour. So this gets them used to your hands, gets them used to them being around, and gets used to them being close without actually physically touching them. Once your bird's used to you being around, used to having your hands around, but may not necessarily want to be petted, there's something you can do called contact training. Now, contact training may sound a little bit like touch or target training, but it's somewhat different. With contact training, what you want to do is start getting your bird used to being touched. I suggest if you're going to try this, your bird's well used to you and it's well used to hands being around, it's also step-up training. So with this, you want to just very lightly touch your bird on the head, then move your hand away, immediately click and positive reinforce. If your bird's scared of a clicker, you can just give the positive reinforcement. So the point of this training is to get them used to being touched, and in a very specific way. You can do it other parts of the body, but I would suggest just the head and neck, and I'll explain why later. This kind of training is not only useful to getting your bird used to being petted and touched, and maybe encouraging it, but also because you may want to inspect your bird and do other things, so it's worth having a go at. So petting should always be consensual. It's very important that your bird actually wants to be touched. And while contact training can help with that and get them used to it, they may not always want to be. So you're teaching tolerance with that training for very specific reasons. For this, what you want to do is look for signs that your bird actually wants to be petted. For example, in a cockatiel or a macaw, they all bow their head and their feathers will get fluffy. And if you put your hand near them, they won't raise their beak. They'll just want to be petted. For a conure, they may start scratching their face. I'll give you a couple of examples of this clip so you can see. But make sure that they actually want to be petted. Don't try and force it. Take it at their pace and just let you and them enjoy it. A good opportunity to encourage petting is sometimes during molting. Parrots get very itchy, they do get quite grumpy and irritable, so be aware of that. So they may nibble when they may not have in other situations, but they're very itchy, they're very uncomfortable, and it may make them want to be petted more. For example, fish started to be excited about petting when he was molting. So it was very interesting to see how he'd start bowing his head, whereas Chip was always keen, and suddenly Fish wanted it too. And since then, he's always wanted to be petted. Now, I'm not saying this will always occur, but during molting, it may give you the opportunity to start forming that petting behaviour with your bird. The last point I'd like to make when you're encouraging your bird to be petted is every bird is an individual. They go at their own paces. Some birds may want petting immediately, other birds may not ever want it. Some may just suddenly decide they want it. So keep looking at your bird for signs, follow these tips and try them out. But if they don't work, don't be disheartened, because they may want to be petted at another point, or they may just not be that sort of bird. You know, it's like humans, some of us don't really like to be touched. Birds are exactly the same. So now I've covered the tips on how to encourage your bird to want to be hugged and petted, I want to talk about how you should do it. Now, for most birds, you only really want to be petting them around the head and the neck. I've said this many times before in other videos. There are obviously exceptions. For example, conures like to be cuddled. But with these exceptions, even then, it can encourage sort of negative behaviours, which I'll go through in a little list. So when you're petting your bird, make sure you always keep it to the head and neck. I know it's really tempting to want to pet them elsewhere, but if you do it just around those areas, it's less likely to cause any sort of negative behaviours that you may not want to see. Now, you can touch your birds elsewhere, and there's a very important reason for this. If you want to check if they have blood feathers, if they've hurt their foot, Chip and Fish decide to fly off, so I'm going to let them crack on. So yeah, if they've hurt themselves somewhere, you can check. Once they're used to being touched, used to being petted, it allows you to check them for signs of injury, which is very important. Now, this sort of thing isn't intended to be petting or hugging, but it's intended to make sure they're okay, and if you desperately need to restrain them for some reason, not for your convenience as an owner, but for their health or for because they're in danger, that sort of thing. So I briefly touched on exceptions to the rule, for example, conures cuddling, macaws, that sort of thing. However, the exceptions to the rule still can encourage negative behaviours. So, for example, if you accidentally touch your bird's wing, that's not really a problem. If you want to give them a little peck on the tummy, again, not really an issue. It's when you're doing it all the time and when you're making stroking motions, that sort of thing is really bad, and it's going to encourage negative behaviours. We see it time and time again for our business, and we sort of discourage owners from doing that. Around the head and neck is best, unless you need to have a look at their foot or for the previous reasons I mentioned. So do bear that in mind, you know. Occasional, very quick touching elsewhere is fine, but it tends to be repeated that causes the problems. I'm going to go through the reasons why you shouldn't do it elsewhere now.
Why don't you just take her away for a minute and then bring her back in?
That's what I'm doing. Why would you not want to touch your bird elsewhere? If you tend to touch your bird anywhere apart from the head and neck, then it tends to encourage them to think you're a little bit more than just a friend, if you get my meaning. So when you do that, you're basically reinforcing to your bird that you're their mate rather than their friend, and that's not something you really want. It's not a desirable trait, and here's the reason why. So when you're touching elsewhere and you're encouraging mating behaviour, it leads on to something called hormonal behaviour. Now, this is one of the most common causes of problems with behaviour in birds, and it's one of the things we get most often of with our business, which I mentioned previously. So when a bird's hormonal, they tend to get very grumpy. It can lead to other undesirable behaviours and frustration, like plucking. It can lead to aggression, all sorts of things you don't want. So it is the number one reason why you do not want to be petting your bird inappropriately. So as I mentioned, it encourages aggression. Your bird can, if it has a biting problem already, it will get a lot more bitey. It will get a lot more aggressive towards other members in your household, and you really do not want to encourage that, because obviously more aggression equals more problems for you. So just by limiting your petting and where you're doing it, you can help curtail this problem. Inappropriate petting also leads to confusion and frustration in your bird. They can't express their feelings to you in the same way, and they get very confused about what the dynamic is in your house. They can even get more aggressive to other birds. So it's very important that you bear this in mind. I mean, as I said, a little bit of touching is fine, and if it's actually needed, but keep it to the head and neck. I'm going to repeat it over and over because it's so important. Now, us humans have loads of natural oils and sort of protections on our skin. This is something that birds don't really want all over their feathers. So when you're constantly stroking your bird's feathers and petting them, it can lead to something called feather bronzing. Now, Pickles came to us with loads of feather bronzing all over her feathers. And while it's not necessarily a health risk, if you're free flying your bird, you do not want it because it is their waterproofing and it helps them fly. But even if they're at home and they're washing regularly, it can lead to them being quite chilly because their feathers do not have waterproofing. Once that bird has feather bronzing, that feather will not recover. So you won't be able to have a nice, pristine, clean feather until it molts that bronzed feather out. So please do keep that in mind. So everyone, thanks very much for watching. I hope you found the tips for encouraging petting and touching, as well as the reasons why you should do it in certain ways, useful. If you have any comments, please do feel free to leave them down below. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, in the meantime, I hope you have a great day and take care.